The first thing Elias Mercer saw when he opened his eyes was a gold wedding band resting against a pregnant stomach that could not possibly be carrying his child. Fluorescent hospital light reflected softly across the curve beneath Naomi's hand while a man's low voice murmured somewhere near the window. Elias couldn't move yet. Couldn't speak. The ventilator tube still burned down his throat, and the machines around him continued their steady rhythm like nothing inside the room had just split open. But his mind was awake enough to notice details. The untouched coffee on the counter. The overnight bag beside Naomi's chair. The second phone charging near the window. And the way she laughed quietly at something the man said, as if this room no longer belonged to her husband. Before we get into this story, comment where you're watching from tonight. Elias would probably appreciate knowing somebody out there was still paying attention. The room smelled like antiseptic and stale air conditioning. Rain tapped softly against the dark hospital window overlooking downtown Atlanta, blurring the city lights into streaks of silver and gold. Elias kept his eyes mostly closed. Instinct. Observation before reaction. Years of risk analysis had trained his mind to slow down under pressure instead of speeding up. The machines continued their measured beeping while Naomi stood near the foot of the bed adjusting the sleeve of her cream-colored coat. She looked different. Sharper somehow. More polished than he remembered. Her hair was shorter now, styled differently, and there was a distance in her posture he felt before he fully understood it. The neurologist said awareness can come in waves, the man near the window said quietly. Calm voice. Educated. Controlled. Elias shifted his gaze slightly without turning his head. Tall. Broad shoulders beneath a charcoal overcoat. Expensive leather shoes. The man stood too comfortably inside the room. Not like a visitor. Like someone who already belonged there. Naomi exhaled slowly. I know, she said. I don't want this to get complicated. Elias felt something cold settle beneath the confusion fogging his body. Not anger. Not yet. Recognition. The kind that arrives before proof does. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice further. You've already carried this alone for almost a year. Naomi looked down at her stomach unconsciously, fingertips resting there with familiar ease. 10 months. Elias heard the number echo through his head like metal striking concrete. 10 months gone. 10 months erased from his life while the world outside continued moving without him. A nurse entered moments later, breaking the tension before it fully formed. Young. Focused. Her badge read Camille Ross. She checked monitors quickly before her eyes flicked toward Elias's face. Her expression changed for half a second. Tiny. Controlled. But Elias caught it. His pupils are responding stronger, she said carefully. Naomi straightened immediately. What does that mean? It means we should notify neurology. Camille adjusted the 4-line with practiced calm, but Elias noticed something else. She looked briefly toward the man by the window before looking away again. Not curiosity. Recognition. As if she already knew him. As if this wasn't the first late-night conversation she'd interrupted inside this room. The doctor arrived 23 minutes later. Elias tracked time automatically through the digital monitor reflection on the television screen across from the bed. Neurology questions followed. Light in his eyes. Motor response. Auditory recognition. Elias answered what he could with slight movement and delayed blinking. Naomi cried softly when the doctor confirmed consciousness recovery potential. Real tears. That confused him more than anything else. Because betrayal would have been simpler if she looked cruel. But Naomi looked exhausted. Frightened. Overwhelmed. Like someone trying desperately to hold together a story already collapsing at the edges. By morning, the hospital floor moved differently around him. More staff entered the room. More paperwork appeared. Someone from rehabilitation discussed extended recovery timelines. Naomi remained close beside the bed whenever doctors entered, fingers wrapped carefully around his hand, speaking gently about his progress like the devoted wife who had never left. But every time the room emptied again, silence returned with strange weight. Elias noticed the gaps. The moments where her attention drifted toward her phone. The subtle tension whenever the man returned. Dr. Adrian Cross, according to the badge clipped beneath his coat later that afternoon. Trauma surgery. Adrian moved through the hospital with quiet authority. Nurses greeted him by first name. Security nodded as he passed. And somehow, despite not being family, he entered Elias's ICU room without ever checking in. That detail stayed with Elias longer than anything else. By evening, rain hammered harder against the windows while Naomi stood near the sink rinsing out a paper coffee cup. Adrian leaned quietly against the wall beside the door, sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms. "You should go home tonight," he told her softly. "You haven't slept." "I'm fine. Naomi." The way he said her name made the room colder. Familiar. Intimate. Practiced. Elias stared at the ceiling above him while his heartbeat monitor ticked steadily beside the bed. He still couldn't fully move his arms yet, but sensation had returned enough for him to feel the hospital blanket against his fingertips. 10 months. His mind kept returning there. 10 months during which legal decisions had been made. Accounts accessed. Narratives formed. Lives rearranged. He looked slowly toward the corner chair beside the window where Naomi's oversized tote bag rested partially open. A thick manila folder sat inside it beneath a stack of folded maternity paperwork. One document protruded slightly from the top. Elias couldn't read most of it from this distance. Only 2 visible words printed across the header before Naomi noticed the folder and quickly turned it away from him. Durable medical proxy. And suddenly Elias understood something far more dangerous than the affair itself. This wasn't chaos. It was structure. Something had been organized while he was unconscious. Something official. Coordinated. Quiet. And judging by how naturally everyone inside this room moved around each other, it had probably started long before he ever opened his eyes. 3 days after regaining full consciousness, Elias Mercer realized the hospital staff spoke around him differently when Naomi entered the room. Conversations shortened. Screens tilted away. Nurses who answered his questions directly during the day suddenly redirected eye contact toward his wife the moment she appeared beside the bed. It wasn't dramatic enough to call out. That was what made it dangerous. The shift lived inside small things. Pauses. Deferred answers. The quiet assumption that Naomi was still the primary authority in the room even while Elias sat awake watching all of it happen. By Thursday morning, he could sit upright for almost 20 minutes without assistance. Rain drifted softly against the ICU windows while muted cable news rolled silently across the television mounted near the ceiling. Naomi stood near the sink answering messages on her phone with one hand resting absently against her stomach. She smiled at the screen once. Not warmly. Automatically. Like someone maintaining several conversations at once. Elias watched the reflection in the stainless steel cabinet instead of looking directly at her. Adrian's name appeared twice across the glowing screen before she angled it away. "Physical therapy thinks you're progressing faster than expected," Naomi said without turning around. Expected. The word stayed with him. Not hoped. Not prayed for. Expected. Elias folded that distinction away quietly. "That's good," he said, voice rough from weeks of disuse. Naomi turned then, almost startled by how steady he sounded. For half a second, something unreadable crossed her face before she softened it again. "Yeah," she said carefully. "It is." But the silence afterward felt wrong. Like both of them understood recovery had introduced complications neither of them had prepared to discuss yet. Later that afternoon, a hospital administrator entered carrying a tablet and several authorization forms. Mid-50s. Expensive glasses. Professional smile practiced enough to survive difficult rooms. Mr. Mercer, we just need to update a few recovery access protocols now that you're alert. He spoke to Elias directly at first. Then Naomi stepped closer beside the bed, and somehow the conversation tilted toward her again. Mrs. Mercer has already been handling long-term care coordination, the administrator explained. Insurance, rehabilitation placement, financial continuity matters, financial continuity. Elias kept his expression neutral while signing the first form slowly with an unsteady hand. The signature looked weaker than he liked. He noticed Naomi watching it carefully. What rehabilitation placement? Elias asked quietly. The administrator blinked once. Tiny hesitation. The assisted neurological facility in Buckhead. Elias looked at Naomi. I'm being transferred. It was temporary, Naomi answered quickly. Until we knew your cognitive outcome. Temporary. Another carefully selected word. Elias stared toward the rain-darkened window while pieces inside his mind began aligning into rough shapes. Someone had already built a version of his future while he was unconscious. A smaller version. Managed. Contained. That evening, Nurse Camille Ross adjusted the medication pump while Naomi stepped out to take a call. Adrian arrived less than 2 minutes later carrying takeout containers and a folded umbrella dripping rainwater onto the tile floor. He stopped short when he saw Elias awake and fully watching him this time. Something tightened subtly across his jaw before the polished calm returned. You're looking stronger, Adrian said. Elias noticed he didn't sound relieved. Trying to be. Adrian nodded once, but his attention moved automatically toward Naomi's empty chair beside the bed. Familiar territory again. Elias studied the small details now that he had the strength to do it properly. Adrian knew where she kept her charger cable. He knew which cabinet held the paper cups. He crossed the room without hesitation, like muscle memory had already formed here over months, not days. Then Camille spoke without looking up from the monitor. You missed rounds yesterday. Adrian's eyes flicked toward her briefly. Long surgery. Nothing else passed between them, but Elias caught it immediately. Not flirtation. Not friendliness. Recognition layered over discomfort. Camille knew something about this dynamic she wasn't saying. After Adrian left, Naomi returned carrying a fresh coffee she never drank. The cup remained untouched beside the window for nearly an hour while she scrolled silently through emails. Elias noticed one subject line reflected faintly across the dark television screen. Mercer Estate Review. His pulse slowed instead of quickening. Controlled. Focused. Estate. Not accounts. Not recovery planning. Estate. As if the system around him had already begun preparing for a version of reality where Elias Mercer no longer existed in practical terms. Then Naomi's phone buzzed again against the counter, lighting the darkened room for half a second. Elias only saw part of the message before she grabbed it too quickly. But one line was enough. The attorney thinks we should finalize before he regains full capacity. The message disappeared from Naomi's phone so quickly Elias almost convinced himself he had imagined it. But the word stayed sharp inside his head long after the screen went dark. Finalize before he regains full capacity. Not if. Before. As if his awareness itself had become a scheduling problem for people already moving pieces around him. Naomi slipped the phone into her coat pocket and glanced toward him too casually. You should try to rest, she said softly. Elias nodded once, the same way he used to during boardroom negotiations when someone underestimated how much he had already noticed. Outside the ICU windows, downtown Atlanta glowed through steady rain, silver reflections sliding across the glass while the hospital floor settled into its midnight quiet. But Elias couldn't stop replaying the word attorney. Not doctor. Not insurance advisor. Attorney. By morning, physical therapy had him walking 12 slow steps beside a parallel support bar while Naomi answered a call near the hallway vending machines. Elias moved carefully, conserving energy, but his hearing sharpened the longer he stayed silent. "No, he's lucid," Naomi whispered tightly. More than they expected. A pause. Then quieter. "I know what the paperwork says." Elias kept his face neutral while adjusting his grip on the rail. The therapist beside him continued discussing recovery milestones, unaware that the room had just shifted beneath his feet again. Paperwork. The same invisible structure circling him from every direction. If you woke up and realized people had already started reorganizing your life without you, what would be the first thing you'd want to know? Elias already knew his answer. Timing. Timing told the truth long before people did. Later that afternoon, Naomi insisted on bringing him fresh clothes from home. "You'll feel more normal," she said. But when the garment bag arrived, Elias noticed immediately what was missing. His tailored charcoal overcoat wasn't there. Neither was his leather laptop case or his engraved watch his father left him before he died. Instead, Naomi brought soft athletic clothes and inexpensive slip-on shoes like she was preparing him for permanent rehabilitation, not recovery. "Most of your work things are packed away right now," she explained while folding shirts into the hospital cabinet. Packed away. Elias studied her quietly. Naomi had always hated clutter, but she never touched his office without asking before the accident. Never. The memory landed harder than he expected because it reminded him something deeper than betrayal had changed. Permission no longer existed inside this marriage. That evening, Elias requested access to his phone for the first time. Naomi hesitated almost invisibly before smiling. "The battery was destroyed after the crash. I've been handling everything for you." Everything. Another dangerous word. "What about my accounts?" he asked carefully. Naomi's expression tightened for half a second. "Your automatic systems covered most things." Most things. Elias watched her too closely now to miss the difference between prepared answers and honest ones. She reached for her water bottle but never drank from it. Small stress response. He remembered that from years of dinners, vacations, and quiet Sunday mornings when work pressure followed her home. Then Adrian walked in without knocking again. This time carrying ultrasound printouts partially visible beneath a folded umbrella. The room changed instantly. Naomi's shoulders relaxed before she could stop them from doing it. Adrian noticed Elias noticing. Nobody spoke for a moment. The silence itself became confirmation. Elias looked away first, not out of weakness but calculation. People revealed more when they believed tension had passed. Adrian placed the folder beside Naomi's purse near the window. One ultrasound image slid loose enough for Elias to catch the date printed along the bottom corner before Naomi quickly covered it with her hand. His pulse slowed. Not because he misunderstood the implication. Because he understood it too clearly. The scan had been performed nearly 7 months earlier. Only 3 months after his accident. But that wasn't the detail that hollowed the room around him. It was the physician information stamped beneath the date. Attending physician, Dr. Adrian Cross. Elias stared quietly at the rain moving down the glass while something cold and precise settled fully into place inside him for the first time since waking up. Adrian hadn't entered this story afterward. He had been inside it from the beginning. After Adrian left the room, Elias did not ask a single question. That was the part Naomi misunderstood about him. Silence had never meant confusion. It meant processing. Organizing. Separating emotion from pattern. The rain outside had stopped sometime after midnight, leaving downtown Atlanta washed in cold blue reflections from the hospital parking structure across the street. Naomi slept curled awkwardly in the reclining chair near the window, one hand resting over her stomach while her phone charged beside her purse. Elias lay awake listening to the steady pulse of the heart monitor and mentally rebuilding the last 10 months from fragments nobody realized they had already given him. The pregnancy timeline. The attorney message. The estate review. Adrian's unrestricted access. None of it behaved like chaos. Systems always revealed themselves through repetition, and Elias was beginning to see repetition everywhere. By Friday morning, he requested access to his recovery documentation. Naomi reacted too quickly. "You should focus on healing first," she said while stirring untouched sweetener into her coffee. Elias noticed she had started doing that recently. Stirring drinks she never consumed whenever conversations drifted toward logistics or paperwork. "I just want to understand where things stand," he replied calmly. Naomi smiled, but exhaustion tightened the edges of it now. "Everything's being handled." Again that phrase. Passive. Vague. As if invisible hands had quietly taken ownership of his life while he slept. 2 hours later, a rehabilitation coordinator arrived carrying a thick binder stamped with Mercer long-term recovery plan across the front. Elias kept his expression neutral as the woman explained housing recommendations, cognitive supervision protocols, transportation limitations, and temporary financial guardianship structures already drafted for review. Already drafted. Who requested these? Elias asked softly. The coordinator glanced instinctively toward Naomi before answering. Your care team and family representatives. Family representatives. Plural. Elias signed nothing. That afternoon, while Naomi stepped downstairs to meet a pharmacy courier, Nurse Camille Ross entered during shift change carrying fresh medication trays. The ICU hallway behind her glowed dim beneath late-evening fluorescent light while security monitors flickered silently near the nurse's station. Camille checked the 4-line before speaking quietly without looking directly at him. You're asking more questions now. Elias studied her carefully. Should I be? Camille adjusted the blanket near his legs with measured precision. People usually don't prepare this much unless they're certain someone isn't coming back. The room went very still after that. Elias watched her face for sarcasm, pity, anything emotional enough to dismiss. There was none. Only restraint. Professional restraint stretched tightly over something she clearly regretted saying aloud. Prepare what exactly? He asked. Camille hesitated. Then her eyes moved briefly toward the empty chair beside the window where Adrian usually sat during overnight visits. You should request your original intake records, she said quietly. Not the summary versions. Before Elias could ask another question, footsteps echoed down the corridor and Camille immediately resumed her clinical tone as another nurse entered behind her. But the damage was done. Intake records. Original versions. Which meant altered narratives already existed somewhere inside the system around him. That realization followed Elias deep into the night. Around 1:13 a.m., unable to sleep, he noticed Naomi's phone vibrating softly against the windowsill while she showered in the family restroom down the hall. The screen illuminated briefly in the darkness. Not a message this time. A calendar notification. Medical Proxy Review, Carter and Vale LLP, April 17. Elias stared at the date. April 17. 3 weeks after his accident. Long before any doctor could reasonably declare permanent cognitive uncertainty. His pulse slowed again instead of rising. April mattered because Elias remembered something else now. That had been the same week Naomi suddenly insisted he transfer certain emergency account authorizations, for convenience, before his business trip to Savannah. At the time, it felt harmless. Efficient. Married people handled logistics all the time. But lying awake beneath the dim ICU lights, listening to the distant hum of elevators moving through the hospital tower, Elias understood something far more dangerous than infidelity was beginning to surface. Naomi and Adrian had not simply adapted to tragedy after the accident. The structure forming around him now, the legal reviews, the estate planning, the access permissions, the rehabilitation containment, showed signs of being assembled by people who already understood exactly which levers mattered long before he ever opened his eyes again. The next morning, Elias requested access to his financial accounts for the first time since waking up. Naomi's reaction lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was enough. Her shoulders stiffened before the concern returned to her face like something carefully reapplied. "You don't need to stress about that yet," she said softly while adjusting the blanket near his legs. Stress. Another convenient framing. Elias nodded as though the explanation satisfied him. It didn't. Because throughout 12 years of marriage, Naomi had always preferred avoiding financial discussions entirely. Budgets bored her. Investment structures irritated her. Yet somehow during the 10 months he'd been unconscious, she had become deeply involved in estate planning, medical authority coordination, account access, and rehabilitation structures precise enough to require attorneys. People didn't evolve that quickly without guidance from someone already inside the system. By noon, a man Elias had never met arrived carrying a slim leather portfolio embossed with Carter and Vale LLP. He introduced himself as Martin Hale, Temporary Estate Continuity Counsel. The title itself felt engineered to sound harmless. Martin spoke in polished corporate tones while reviewing temporary authorization updates Naomi had prudently initiated after the accident. Prudently. Another word chosen carefully enough to avoid sounding predatory. Elias sat upright in bed listening while the attorney outlined asset preservation protocols, medical liability shielding, deferred account management, and transitional authority procedures already in motion. Already in motion. Not proposed. Not pending. Elias noticed something else too. Martin never once asked Elias what he wanted. The entire conversation functioned around maintaining structures built during his absence. Most clients prefer continuity during neurological uncertainty, Martin explained smoothly. Clients. Not patients. Not families. Clients. Elias kept his expression measured while signing nothing. Outside the room, rain darkened the hospital windows again, streaking silver across the Atlanta skyline while staff moved quietly through the corridor. The world continued functioning with efficient indifference. Inside the room, Elias began seeing the edges of something larger than betrayal. This was infrastructure. Legal. Financial. Social. Coordinated. Later that evening, Naomi left briefly to meet with Martin downstairs in the hospital cafe. She assumed Elias was asleep when she walked out. He waited exactly 30 seconds before slowly reaching for the tablet left charging beside his bed. His motor control still lagged slightly, but not enough anymore. The hospital guest Wi-Fi loaded painfully slow beneath trembling fingers while he searched Carter and Vale LLP. Estate litigation. Asset protection. Family continuity law. High net worth medical incapacitation cases. Elias stared at the screen while cold understanding settled deeper inside him. This wasn't a random attorney Naomi found after a tragedy. This firm specialized in controlling wealth structures when powerful individuals became medically vulnerable. Then another detail surfaced. Senior Medical Consultant Partnership, Dr. Adrian Cross. Elias sat very still. The room suddenly felt smaller. Adrian wasn't simply connected to Naomi. He was professionally embedded into the exact legal ecosystem now surrounding Elias's life. The pieces aligned too cleanly to ignore anymore. Near midnight, Nurse Camille entered quietly with medication while the television reflected soft blue light across the walls. Elias lowered the tablet before she could see it. But Camille noticed anyway. "You're figuring it out faster than they expected," she said carefully. Elias studied her. "Who's they?" Camille hesitated. Long enough to answer without words. Then she adjusted the 4 tubing and spoke almost under her breath. "Do you know how many times your discharge timeline changed while you were unconscious?" Elias said nothing. 3. She glanced toward the closed hallway door before continuing. Every time doctors thought neurological recovery was possible, someone pushed for extended supervised care instead. Elias felt the shift immediately. Not emotionally. Structurally. Recovery delays. Legal continuity. Estate management. Medical authority. Rehabilitation containment. These weren't isolated reactions anymore. They were coordinated interests benefiting from the same outcome, Elias remaining dependent, controlled, and professionally absent. Camille stepped back toward the doorway, but paused before leaving. "Your mother came here 4 months ago," she said quietly. Security denied her access. Elias looked up sharply for the first time since waking from the coma. Camille's expression tightened. "What's strange is," she said carefully, "the restriction request didn't come from the hospital." Then she walked out, leaving Elias alone beneath the dim ICU lights while rain slid slowly down the glass outside and one horrifying realization settled fully into place. Someone had not only prepared for his absence. They had actively protected the system built around it. For the first time since waking up, Elias Mercer stopped thinking like a husband and started thinking like a systems analyst again. The emotional shock was still there, buried somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the constant chemical haze of recovery, but another part of him had taken over now. The quieter part. The dangerous part people usually mistook for passivity. He lay awake before sunrise watching security lights flicker across the rain-darkened hospital parking structure while replaying every detail Camille had revealed the night before. His mother had been denied access. Not by the hospital. Which meant someone with legal authority had actively controlled who could and could not reach him during the coma. That was no longer emotional betrayal. That was containment. Around 6:40 a.m., Naomi stepped out into the hallway to take another private call. Elias waited until her voice faded beyond the nurse's station before reaching slowly for the rehabilitation binder left beside his bed. This time he flipped deeper into the paperwork instead of stopping at the surface summaries. Structured care projections. Estate continuity reviews. Transitional medical oversight clauses. Then a page near the back stopped him cold. Mercer Protective Asset Stabilization Protocol. Elias stared at the header while fluorescent light hummed softly overhead. Protective asset stabilization was not ordinary family medical language. It was institutional wealth language. High net worth incapacitation structures. If you've ever realized people around you were quietly making decisions about your life without your knowledge, you already know how terrifying calm can feel in that moment. Elias kept turning pages slowly. Buried beneath legal terminology and medical coordination language sat references to trust preservation recommendations, executive risk exposure mitigation, and temporary authority redistribution tied to his anticipated long-term neurological uncertainty. Anticipated. Again, not possible. Not feared. Anticipated. Someone had built legal assumptions around the expectation that he would never fully return. Then another name appeared repeatedly throughout the documentation. Blackridge Strategic Holdings. Elias frowned slightly. The name triggered something distant in his memory. Not from Naomi. From work. Blackridge wasn't medical. It was connected to infrastructure acquisitions and private investment restructuring. Why would an incapacitation plan reference an external holdings group? Before he could examine further, footsteps approached and Elias quietly closed the binder just as Martin Hale entered carrying another leather portfolio. "Good morning, Elias," the attorney said smoothly, speaking with practiced warmth now that recovery seemed unavoidable. "I wanted to review some continuity adjustments while Naomi's downstairs." Continuity adjustments. Every phrase in this ecosystem softened the truth intentionally. Martin sat beside the window while rain slid down the glass behind him in silver lines. "You built an impressive protection structure before the accident," he continued casually. "Most people in your position don't think so far ahead." Elias watched him carefully. "Most people in your position." There it was again. The subtle acknowledgement everyone around him kept accidentally revealing. They knew far more about his financial positioning than Naomi had ever shown interest in during their marriage. "What position is that?" Elias asked quietly. Martin paused for the first time since entering the room. Tiny hesitation. "Professional recalibration. Your asset exposure level," he answered carefully. "Your advisory equity interests created some vulnerabilities after the accident." Advisory equity interests. Naomi had always treated Elias's consulting work like background noise compared to her corporate career. But this attorney clearly didn't. Martin spoke to him now with the cautious tone people used around individuals connected to real money and legal leverage. Which meant the structures forming around Elias were not only about protecting Naomi. They were about protecting something larger tied to him professionally. After Martin left, Elias stared toward the muted television while pieces continued aligning inside his head. Then Camille entered again near shift change carrying updated medication charts. "You know what Blackridge Strategic Holdings is?" Elias asked quietly. Camille stopped moving for half a second. That was all he needed. "You shouldn't know that name yet," she said carefully. Elias felt the room narrow around him. "Why?" Camille glanced toward the hallway before lowering her voice. "Because Blackridge representatives started visiting 6 weeks after your accident." Elias said nothing. "Private meetings," she continued softly. "With Naomi. With Martin Hale. Sometimes with Dr. Cross." The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead while Elias processed the implication in complete silence. Not random visits. Not emotional support. Coordinated strategy meetings happening while he was unconscious. Camille looked toward the closed ICU door once more before speaking the sentence that changed the entire shape of the story. "One of the men from Blackridge said your accident solved a very expensive problem." Then she walked out, leaving Elias alone with the horrifying realization that whatever system had formed around his coma was never just about a marriage falling apart. Somewhere behind the hospital walls, the legal paperwork, and Naomi's carefully controlled grief, people with power and money had already begun treating Elias Mercer's disappearance like an opportunity. By the following Monday, Elias Mercer understood the most dangerous part of the situation was not that people believed he was weak. It was that they had grown comfortable believing it for too long. The hospital room had become strangely revealing now that he stopped reacting emotionally and started observing structurally. Naomi no longer hit her private calls with the same urgency. Martin Hale entered without asking permission. Adrian spoke around Elias instead of to him during medical discussions, his tone carrying the subtle confidence of a man who believed control had already been secured months ago. They all behaved like people operating inside a system that had stabilized successfully. And systems became careless when they thought the outcome was permanent. Rain pressed softly against the dark ICU windows while Elias sat upright reviewing rehabilitation notes for the 3rd time that morning. This time he noticed something different. The projected long-term care facility wasn't simply medical. It was connected to a gated recovery campus partially owned through a holding company tied back to Blackridge Strategic Holdings. Elias almost smiled when he saw it. Too clean. Too centralized. The same network touching medical authority, estate continuity, rehabilitation placement, and asset stabilization. Someone had built vertical control around his incapacitation. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it clarified the battlefield. Naomi returned shortly afterward carrying expensive coffee from the lobby cafe she still never drank. "Martin thinks it's best if we avoid overwhelming transitions during recovery," she said while setting the untouched cup near the window. Elias nodded slowly. "Makes sense." Naomi relaxed almost imperceptibly at the answer. That was becoming useful to him now, watching relief appear whenever he behaved smaller than he truly was. She still believed confusion lingered beneath his calm. Adrian believed it too. They both mistook restraint for dependency. By afternoon, Martin Hale arrived again with additional authorization amendments. The attorney spoke carefully now, more respectful than before, though he tried disguising it beneath clinical professionalism. Elias noticed small changes in body language people rarely controlled consciously. Martin no longer leaned casually over paperwork. He kept folders closed unless necessary. He answered direct questions more cautiously. Somewhere inside the legal structure surrounding this situation, someone had started realizing Elias Mercer was not recovering the way they anticipated. "These are temporary continuity extensions," Martin explained while sliding documents across the tray table. Elias scanned the pages briefly. Temporary guardianship reinforcement. Deferred voting authority. Proxy preservation clauses. There it was. Voting authority. Not personal accounts. Not household finances. Corporate influence. Hidden beneath medical language sat references to infrastructure advisory shares tied to regional transportation development groups. Elias finally understood why Blackridge cared. His consulting work had never been ordinary consulting. Years earlier, he had quietly structured minority equity positions into infrastructure risk deals most people overlooked. Ports. Freight corridors. Municipal transit contracts. Boring industries to outsiders. Extremely valuable to acquisition firms. Naomi had always dismissed those deals as spreadsheet work. But the men surrounding her clearly understood their true scale. Later that night, after Naomi fell asleep beneath the muted television glow, Elias requested access to the hospital desktop terminal under the pretense of reviewing neurological exercises. The overnight nurse barely glanced at him before granting temporary access. 10 minutes later, Elias sat alone in the dim room scrolling through archived financial disclosures tied to Blackridge acquisitions. Patterns emerged immediately. Blackridge specialized in consolidating distressed infrastructure positions before major state contract expansions. Quiet money. Strategic money. The kind that moved before headlines existed. Then Elias found his own name buried inside a deferred acquisition memorandum dated 8 months before the accident. Mercer Advisory Interests, pending transfer conditionally delayed. Elias read the line 3 times. Pending transfer. Conditionally delayed. His accident had interrupted something already in motion long before the crash itself. The room grew colder around him. He opened the attachment linked beneath the memorandum, but the file required executive-level authorization credentials only he possessed personally. Not Naomi. Not Martin. Not Blackridge. Him. For the first time since waking up, Elias leaned back slowly against the hospital bed and allowed himself the smallest controlled breath of realization. Everyone around him believed they were protecting access to power he no longer understood. But somewhere inside the hidden structure built around his disappearance sat a locked layer none of them had managed to open without him. And judging by how aggressively they had worked to keep him controlled, dependent, and professionally isolated, whatever waited behind those authorization credentials was important enough to scare people with money, attorneys, and institutional influence. The next 48 hours changed the balance of the room in ways nobody except Elias seemed to notice. He became easier. More cooperative. He stopped asking direct questions about legal paperwork and rehabilitation timelines. He let Martin Hale explain continuity structures without interruption. He even allowed Naomi to guide conversations again when nurses entered the room. The shift relaxed everyone around him almost immediately. Adrian resumed speaking near him instead of around him. Naomi smiled more naturally. Martin stopped guarding every document so tightly. It confirmed something Elias had understood years ago in corporate negotiations: people revealed the most once they believed resistance was over. Rain moved softly against the hospital glass while downtown Atlanta glowed silver beneath low clouds. Elias sat quietly reviewing physical therapy exercises while internally rebuilding an entirely different structure. The executive authorization file still sat inaccessible behind biometric verification protocols tied to his private infrastructure advisory network. Not impossible to reach. Just impossible from inside a monitored hospital room. And judging by the anxiety surrounding his cognitive recovery, somebody outside this room was becoming increasingly aware of that fact too. On Wednesday afternoon, Naomi left for what she described as a prenatal specialist appointment. Adrian picked her up personally from the underground parking level instead of using valet access like he usually did. Elias noticed because the hospital's security monitor reflected briefly off the dark television screen near his bed. Black SUV. Private entrance access. Coordinated timing. Small details, but patterns always lived inside small details first. 20 minutes after they left, Elias made his first move. "I need my personal recovery notebook," he told the daytime nurse calmly. Black leather. Initials embossed. The request sounded harmless because it was designed to. The notebook arrived an hour later from hospital storage along with several personal effects Naomi apparently forgot remained logged under restricted inventory. Elias opened it slowly once the room emptied. Most pages contained ordinary project notes and infrastructure calculations. But tucked into the inner sleeve sat something much more important, a secondary encrypted security token no one else knew existed. Elias stared at it quietly while fluorescent light hummed overhead. Naomi had controlled accounts. Martin controlled legal access. Blackridge controlled external coordination. But none of them understood how Elias actually structured risk containment. The most sensitive advisory holdings were never tied directly to marital access or primary incapacitation protocols. Years ago, after watching a senior executive lose control of a company during a medical crisis, Elias quietly built compartmentalized authorization layers no single proxy could fully override. Even Naomi never knew the deeper structures existed because he never felt the need to explain them. Until now. That evening, Martin Hale arrived carrying revised rehabilitation transfer schedules. More urgency this time. Less polish. Blackridge representatives feel continuity is becoming increasingly time-sensitive, he explained carefully while reviewing transfer dates. Elias almost smiled at the wording. Blackridge representatives feel. Not Naomi. Not doctors. The real pressure source was finally surfacing openly now. How involved is Blackridge in my medical recovery? Elias asked mildly. Martin paused. Tiny hesitation again. Their exposure intersects with several of your advisory positions. Exposure. Another financial word accidentally escaping into a supposedly medical conversation. Elias leaned back slowly against the bed. Sounds expensive. Martin studied him differently after that. More cautiously. As if some instinct finally whispered that the man everyone built this structure around might understand far more than expected. Later that night, after Naomi returned and eventually fell asleep beneath the muted television glow, Elias activated the encrypted token using the hospital desktop terminal. A secure authentication portal opened almost instantly beneath dark blue security screens. Multiple locked holdings appeared. Transit infrastructure equity. Deferred acquisition blocks. Offshore strategic reserves. Then one line froze his attention completely. Emergency succession override authority, active only upon personal executive reassertion. Elias read it twice. Personal executive reassertion. Meaning the entire Blackridge acquisition structure currently surrounding him remained incomplete until he personally reclaimed control. The hidden system built around his coma was not fully secured after all. It was waiting. Waiting for access only Elias could legally trigger. Then another notification appeared at the bottom of the screen. Unauthorized succession inquiry attempts detected during incapacitation period, 17. Elias sat very still in the dark hospital room while rain slid down the windows behind him and a slow, controlled realization settled into place. 17 separate attempts had already been made to penetrate structures nobody around him fully understood. Which meant the people smiling softly beside his hospital bed were not simply protecting wealth anymore. They were trying, and failing, to reach something valuable enough to risk building an entire hidden system around a man they thought would never wake up. By Thursday afternoon, Elias Mercer understood something almost funny about the people surrounding him. The closer they believed they were to winning, the less disciplined they became. Naomi had stopped hiding overnight bags in Adrian's car. Martin Hale no longer filtered legal language carefully enough to disguise financial urgency. Even Blackridge representatives had started appearing in the hospital openly instead of through indirect meetings. Confidence was loosening the structure around them. And Elias intended to let it happen. Rain hammered softly against the dark hospital windows while Atlanta traffic glowed beneath the storm in long ribbons of white and red light. Naomi sat beside the bed scrolling through nursery furniture on her phone as if normal domestic life had already replaced the marriage she once built with him. Adrian thinks it's better if we avoid overwhelming you with business stress right now, she said casually without looking up. Elias almost smiled at that. Adrian thinks. Not doctors. Not therapists. Adrian. The man had begun speaking into decisions that should never have belonged to him publicly enough that Naomi no longer noticed she was revealing it. Elias nodded calmly. Probably smart. Naomi relaxed again. That reaction had become predictable now. Every time Elias acted smaller, slower, weaker, the entire system surrounding him loosened another inch. If you were watching this happen from the outside, you'd probably start wondering the same thing Elias already understood: at what point do overconfident people stop realizing they're exposing themselves? Later that evening, Martin Hale returned carrying revised continuity agreements and a rehabilitation transfer timeline accelerated by nearly 3 weeks. Too fast. The urgency practically bled through the paperwork now. Blackridge wants stabilization finalized before the next quarter closes, Martin explained carefully while laying documents across the tray table. There it was again. Not medical recovery. Not family concerns. Quarter closes. Financial calendar language. Elias scanned the paperwork slowly, pretending fatigue while noting every inconsistency. Temporary executive authority preservation had expanded into voting contingency preparation. Deferred acquisition language had shifted from conditional to transitional. Someone expected major movement soon. That seems aggressive, Elias said mildly. Martin's jaw tightened before he smoothed it away. Markets don't wait for ideal timing. Markets. Another accidental truth slipping through. Elias leaned back quietly while his pulse remained perfectly steady. He could feel the pressure building around him now like structural strain beneath concrete. Blackridge needed something finalized before he fully re-entered the system personally. Which meant whatever authority remained locked behind his executive credentials had become more dangerous to them with every day he recovered. Around midnight, after Naomi fell asleep beside the window beneath the muted blue glow of the television, Elias activated the encrypted token again. This time the portal accepted deeper verification layers using biometric voice recognition he had recovered enough to complete. New files opened immediately. Confidential acquisition structures. Offshore transit holdings. Emergency succession contingencies. Then a folder marked Mercer Override Protocol appeared at the bottom of the screen. Elias opened it slowly. The room felt silent enough to hear the rain sliding down glass 20 stories above the city. Inside sat a single authorization clause dated 2 years before the accident. In the event of executive incapacitation, all strategic transfer proceedings remain reversible upon direct principal reassertion prior to finalization. Reversible. Elias stared at the word while understanding settled into place with terrifying clarity. Everything Blackridge, Martin, Naomi, and Adrian had built over the last 10 months still depended on one final condition they had not secured: Elias remaining professionally absent long enough for irreversible transfer completion. Which explained the rehabilitation acceleration. The legal pressure. The containment structures. The restricted family access. They were running out of time. Then another file notification flashed across the bottom corner of the portal. Pending board session, Blackridge Strategic Holdings, Friday 8 p.m., executive transfer vote. Elias opened the attendance list and saw Adrian Cross's name beside Martin Hale's. Naomi Mercer listed under family continuity representation. But the final name changed everything. Interim proxy authority pending, N. Mercer contingent upon principal incapacity confirmation. Elias sat very still in the dark hospital room while thunder rolled faintly beyond the skyline. They weren't simply protecting assets anymore. They were preparing to transfer power officially using his coma as the mechanism. And unless Elias moved before Friday night, the hidden system built around his disappearance might become permanent in ways even he would struggle to reverse. Friday arrived with the kind of quiet pressure Elias Mercer used to feel before high-level infrastructure negotiations where entire regional contracts could shift hands behind closed doors. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody panicked. But every conversation carried hidden weight beneath it. The hospital floor itself felt different now. More movement. More private meetings. More suited men entering elevators that required executive clearance access. By noon, Naomi had changed clothes twice. Adrian spent nearly an hour inside a conference room 2 floors below the ICU with Martin Hale and 2 Blackridge representatives Elias recognized from archived acquisition filings. Nobody bothered disguising the coordination anymore. They believed the outcome was already secured. Rain covered Atlanta in cold gray sheets while black SUVs lined the lower hospital entrance beneath glowing security lights. Elias sat near the window during physical therapy pretending fatigue while quietly tracking the rhythm of the day. Every move around him revolved around one approaching event, the executive transfer vote scheduled for 8 o'clock that evening. And judging by the tightening urgency across everyone's behavior, something critical still remained unresolved before it could happen. Around 2:15 p.m., Naomi entered carrying a garment bag in a forced softness that immediately made Elias suspicious. "There's a private gathering tonight," she explained carefully while hanging the bag near the closet. "Blackridge wants to acknowledge everything that's happened and discuss transition planning respectfully." Respectfully. Elias almost admired the wording. Corporate grief wrapped around hostile acquisition language. "Sounds formal," he said mildly. Naomi nodded too quickly. "It's mostly legal and administrative." But the garment bag told a different story. Inside hung a dark tailored suit Elias had not seen since before the accident. One Naomi previously claimed was packed away in storage. He recognized it instantly because she had bought it for him after he finalized a municipal transit advisory deal 3 years earlier. Which meant she hadn't removed his old life from the house completely after all. She had selectively hidden parts of it. Later that afternoon, Martin Hale arrived carrying a thin black portfolio unlike the thicker continuity binders he usually brought. Smaller. More final. "Tonight's vote will mostly formalize existing structures," Martin explained while remaining carefully standing instead of sitting this time. "Nothing operational changes immediately." Operational. Another accidental truth. Elias watched him silently long enough for the attorney to become uncomfortable beneath the quiet eye contact. "And if I object?" Elias asked softly. Martin's jaw tightened. "The medical continuity findings remain active." There it was. The hidden threat finally exposed plainly enough to hear. Not emotional persuasion anymore. Institutional leverage. They intended to use his medical status itself as containment if necessary. Elias leaned back calmly against the hospital bed while monitors beeped steadily beside him. "Understood." Martin visibly relaxed after that answer, which told Elias exactly how badly they still needed compliance. By early evening, the city beyond the hospital windows dissolved into rain and glowing skyscraper reflections while nurses prepared discharge transport protocols for the temporary board appearance downstairs. Temporary. Everything in this system hid behind temporary language while moving toward permanent transfer. Adrian arrived just after 7 wearing a charcoal suit and the same expensive watch Elias remembered seeing in the ultrasound room months earlier. This time Adrian didn't even pretend distance from Naomi. His hand rested lightly against her lower back while discussing elevator timing with hospital security. Public familiarity now. Ownership behavior. They had crossed into the confidence phase completely. Elias allowed them to underestimate him a little longer. He dressed slowly in silence while Naomi adjusted his tie with strangely practiced tenderness that no longer felt connected to love at all. It felt procedural now. Like preparing an image for presentation. "This won't take long," she said softly. Elias met her eyes for the first time in hours. "I know." Something about his tone unsettled her instantly. Tiny reaction. Barely visible. But enough. The executive elevator carried them downward through quiet floors glowing gold beneath recessed lighting while rain hammered the glass exterior of the hospital tower. 2 Blackridge representatives waited in the lobby beside Martin Hale. Security staff stood farther back than usual. Controlled perimeter. Private event management. Elias noticed everything automatically now. The expensive shoes. The sealed document cases. The way conversation stopped entirely when he stepped off the elevator. They still saw him as fragile, but no longer harmless. And that difference mattered. Martin moved toward a set of dark wooden double doors at the end of the corridor leading into a private boardroom suite overlooking downtown Atlanta. Muffled conversation waited beyond it. Executives. Attorneys. Investors. People preparing to formalize ownership structures built around a man they believed had spent 10 months unconscious while they quietly rearranged his entire life. Elias adjusted the cuff of his suit calmly as thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city skyline. Then he felt the encrypted security token resting hidden inside his jacket pocket and realized something almost frighteningly simple. Everyone inside that room believed tonight was the end of the process. None of them understood it was about to become the beginning of a completely different war. The boardroom overlooking downtown Atlanta was quieter than Elias Mercer expected. Not nervous quiet. Controlled quiet. The kind powerful people cultivated when they believed outcomes had already been decided before anyone entered the room. Floor-to-ceiling glass reflected rain and city lights across polished black marble while executives from Blackridge Strategic Holdings sat around the long walnut conference table beside attorneys, financial advisors, and private equity representatives Elias recognized from acquisition filings buried deep inside the encrypted portal. Naomi sat near the center beside Adrian Cross, one hand resting against her stomach while Martin Hale organized sealed folders in precise stacks. Nobody looked at Elias like a threat. They looked at him like a procedural complication finally reaching conclusion. That assumption lasted exactly 4 minutes. "Before we begin formal transfer review," Martin announced smoothly, "we need final confirmation of executive incapacity continuity authorization." Elias sat quietly at the far end of the table beneath the muted glow of recessed lighting while security staff remained stationed near the elevators outside. Rain rolled slowly down the glass behind the skyline. "Understood," Elias said calmly. Then he removed the encrypted security token from inside his jacket and placed it softly onto the conference table. The sound itself changed the room. Small. Metallic. Precise. Martin stopped speaking mid-sentence. Adrian's posture shifted instantly. One of the Blackridge executives looked sharply toward another across the table. Naomi frowned in visible confusion. Elias watched all of it happen without changing expression. "That shouldn't be in your possession," Martin said carefully after a long silence. Elias folded his hands. "Apparently it is." Nobody moved for nearly 3 seconds. Then the room's confidence began cracking in subtle ways Elias recognized immediately. People stopped leaning back comfortably. Conversations stopped overlapping naturally. One executive reached for water without drinking it. Tiny behavioral fractures spreading beneath controlled surfaces. Martin recovered first. The continuity process remains valid regardless, he said evenly. But the certainty was gone now. Elias looked toward the sealed folders stacked near the center of the table. Not according to the Mercer override protocol. This time several people visibly reacted. Naomi turned toward Martin immediately. "What protocol?" she asked quietly. Martin didn't answer her. That told Elias more than any document could have. If you've ever watched powerful people suddenly realize someone they underestimated knows the one thing they hoped stayed hidden, you know how fast a room can change temperature without anyone raising their voice. Adrian finally spoke. "Elias, this doesn't need to become adversarial." Elias almost smiled at the wording. Become adversarial. As though the last 10 months had been cooperative. Then maybe nobody should have built a succession structure around a man who was still alive, Elias replied calmly. Silence hit the room harder than anger would have. Naomi stared at him now like she was seeing a stranger emerge beneath the patient she believed she understood. Martin opened one of the folders quickly. The board vote can proceed under temporary incapacity findings until legal review. No, another voice interrupted from near the doorway. Every head turned simultaneously. Gloria Mercer stood beside the conference room entrance in a dark navy coat still damp from rain, flanked by a gray-haired attorney Elias recognized instantly. Walter Gaines. Senior Litigation Counsel. Old Atlanta Money. Quietly feared in corporate restructuring disputes. Elias had contacted him 2 hours earlier through the encrypted network after regaining direct executive authentication access. Walter stepped forward slowly, placing a thin leather folder onto the table beside the security token. Direct principal reassertion has already been legally filed with state corporate oversight 43 minutes ago, he said calmly. Every continuity transfer discussed in this room is now frozen pending forensic review. The collapse began silently. One Blackridge executive muttered something under his breath. Martin's face lost color for the first time all night. Adrian looked toward Naomi sharply, as if calculating what she knew versus what she had been told. But Naomi wasn't looking at any of them anymore. She was staring at Elias with something far worse than anger settling into her expression now. Realization. Not about the money. Not even about the legal structures. About him. About the fact that the quiet man they built an entire system around controlling had apparently understood the board better than anyone sitting at it. Walter opened the leather folder slowly while rain hammered against the windows high above the city. Unfortunately, he continued, our preliminary review has already identified 17 unauthorized succession inquiries made during Mr. Mercer's incapacitation. Nobody moved. Several of which, Walter added carefully, appear tied to coordinated acquisition attempts involving Blackridge Strategic Holdings and individuals physically present in this room tonight. The silence afterward felt almost violent in its stillness. Then Elias noticed something that changed the shape of the night completely. One of the Blackridge executives near the far end of the table was no longer looking at Elias. He was looking at Adrian Cross with pure contained panic. And in that exact moment, Elias understood the terrifying truth neither Naomi nor Adrian seemed to realize yet. The system collapsing around them was much larger, much more expensive, and far more dangerous than a hidden affair or stolen marriage. And now that the reversal had started, somebody inside Blackridge was about to lose far more than reputation. The collapse did not happen loudly. That was the first thing Elias Mercer noticed after Walter Gaines finished speaking. Nobody slammed fists onto the conference table. Nobody shouted. The room simply began breaking apart in silence, the way powerful systems always did when everyone inside suddenly realized the protections they trusted no longer existed. Rain streaked down the towering glass walls behind the Atlanta skyline while Blackridge executives exchanged tight, unreadable looks across the polished table. One man quietly closed his folder without another word. Another immediately stepped away from Adrian Cross as though physical distance itself might reduce liability. Elias watched all of it with calm detachment. The alliances were already shifting. That meant fear had entered the room. Naomi looked between Martin Hale and Adrian now with growing disbelief settling across her face. "What unauthorized inquiries?" she asked quietly. Nobody answered her immediately. That silence told her more than words could. Martin loosened his tie for the first time all evening before speaking carefully toward Walter Gaines. "There's no evidence Mrs. Mercer participated knowingly in any improper acquisition attempts." Knowingly. Elias noticed Naomi catch the word instantly. Her expression changed again. Smaller this time. Less defensive. More frightened. Because people only started separating legal responsibility when collapse became real. Adrian stepped forward smoothly, trying to regain control of the room. "This is becoming unnecessarily dramatic," he said. The succession discussions were precautionary due to medical uncertainty. Elias almost admired the confidence it took to keep speaking that way while the structure underneath him cracked apart visibly. Walter opened another folder slowly. "Then perhaps you can explain why your hospital access credentials were used during 7 restricted continuity review sessions involving Blackridge Acquisition Council." Adrian froze for half a second. Tiny. But irreversible. The room noticed it too. If you've ever watched someone realize the evidence against them is larger than they imagined, you know the exact moment panic first enters their eyes before they fully lose control of their expression. Naomi turned toward Adrian immediately. "What sessions?" she asked quietly. Adrian didn't answer quickly enough. That was the moment everything changed for her emotionally. Not the affair. Not the pregnancy. Not even Elias reclaiming control. It was realizing she had never actually seen the full board herself. She had been positioned inside someone else's strategy too. One of the Blackridge executives stood abruptly near the far side of the table. "We were told Mercer's recovery probability was negligible," he snapped toward Martin Hale. "We were also told succession authorization layers were already compromised." Compromised. Elias leaned back slightly in his chair while city lights shimmered against the rain outside. There it was. The real objective finally exposed publicly enough to breathe inside the room. They had not simply waited for his absence to create opportunity. They believed someone had already weakened the protection surrounding his holdings before the accident even happened. Naomi looked physically unsteady now. "Before the accident," she whispered. Adrian finally lost composure then. "Naomi, stop talking. Too sharp. Too fast." Several heads turned immediately. Walter Gaines closed the folder in front of him with quiet precision. "Unfortunately," he said calmly, "federal forensic review may now become necessary due to attempted executive manipulation tied to interstate infrastructure contracts." Federal. The word landed like cold steel across the room. One Blackridge representative immediately requested legal counsel. Another quietly exited the boardroom entirely while speaking into his phone. The prestige and certainty that existed when Elias entered the room less than an hour earlier had completely dissolved into damage control and personal survival. Naomi stared at Elias across the long conference table now with tears forming slowly in her eyes for the first time since his coma ended. Not performative tears. Real ones. Because she finally understood something devastating. Elias had never been the weakest person in the marriage. He had simply been the quietest. And the silence she mistook for passivity had allowed him to survive long enough to see everything clearly. Adrian moved toward her instinctively, but Naomi stepped away from him before he could touch her. Another shift. Another fracture. Elias noticed Martin watching that moment with contained dread because attorneys understood symbolism better than anyone. Public separation inside collapsing alliances mattered. Rain hammered harder against the windows while security staff quietly entered the boardroom corridor outside. Nobody missed that detail either. Walter leaned toward Elias slightly. "The emergency injunction is already active," he said quietly enough for only Elias to hear. "Every transfer structure tied to your incapacitation has been frozen." Elias nodded once. Calm. Controlled. No triumph. Because this had stopped being about revenge hours ago. Now it was about consequences moving through systems too large for anyone in the room to contain anymore. Then Naomi spoke again, barely above a whisper. Elias. He looked at her finally. Really looked at her. And for the first time since waking from the coma, she seemed to understand the terrifying truth sitting quietly across from her. The man everyone built an entire hidden structure around controlling was no longer trapped inside it. And now that the system had failed, every person who helped create it was about to face what remained after the silence ended. 3 months later, the rain had finally stopped over Atlanta. Morning sunlight stretched across the glass walls of Elias Mercer's private office downtown, washing the room in soft gold instead of the cold fluorescent glare that had followed him through hospital corridors and boardrooms for nearly a year. The city moved below him in quiet motion, traffic lights changing, black cars sliding through intersections, people carrying coffee into buildings where entire worlds shifted every day without anyone noticing. Elias stood near the window with one hand resting against the cool glass, stronger now, steadier now, watching the skyline breathe beneath clear skies for the first time since waking from the coma. The silence around him no longer felt empty. It felt earned. The investigations moved quickly after the Black Ridge collapse began. Executive transfer attempts tied to incapacitation fraud triggered federal scrutiny across multiple acquisition structures. Martin Hale surrendered his legal license before formal proceedings finished. Several Blackridge board members quietly resigned within weeks. Adrian Cross disappeared from hospital leadership entirely after internal review committees opened inquiries into unauthorized medical coordination and restricted access manipulation during Elias's coma. None of it happened dramatically in public. That was the strange thing about powerful systems collapsing. Most of the destruction happened quietly behind closed doors where reputations died long before headlines appeared. Elias never attended the hearings personally. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke clearly enough without him standing in the middle of it demanding revenge. Naomi contacted him only twice after the boardroom collapse. The first time was through attorneys regarding finalized separation agreements and asset disclosures. The second was more personal. A voicemail left late one night while Elias sat alone reviewing infrastructure proposals beneath dim office lights overlooking the city. She sounded exhausted. Smaller somehow. "I don't think I ever understood who you were," she admitted softly through the speaker. Elias listened to the message once and never played it again. Not because it hurt too much. Because by then, the pain had already changed shape. The sharp betrayal was gone now, replaced by something quieter and heavier. Recognition. Naomi had spent years mistaking calmness for weakness because she only understood visible power. Titles. Presence. Attention. But Elias had never built his life loudly. He built it carefully. Layer by layer. Protection by protection. Quiet men often disappeared in plain sight until the moment systems failed and everyone realized they had been holding the structure together the entire time. Around noon, Gloria Mercer entered the office carrying 2 coffees and the same calm dignity she had carried through the entire nightmare. "Your final recovery clearance came through," she said, setting the cup beside him. Elias nodded once. Fully restored authority. Full executive reinstatement. No remaining continuity restrictions. The words should have felt triumphant. Instead they felt peaceful. Across the office sat a sealed storage box containing the last personal items returned from the Mercer home after legal separation finalized 2 weeks earlier. Elias had not opened it yet. Eventually he walked over and lifted the lid carefully. Inside sat old photographs, a silver wedding frame, several handwritten anniversary cards, and the charcoal tie Naomi adjusted before the boardroom meeting where everything collapsed. Elias looked at the objects quietly for a long moment before closing the box again. Not anger. Not nostalgia. Just acceptance. Some things didn't need to be destroyed to be left behind. By evening, the city outside his office windows glowed deep orange beneath the setting sun while the final transfer documents disappeared into encrypted archives under his restored authorization control. Every holding remained his. Every structure had reverted legally the moment he reclaimed direct executive authority. The system built around his absence was gone now. And so was the version of Elias Mercer everyone once underestimated. As the office lights dimmed automatically around him, Elias picked up his coat and headed toward the private elevator alone. Calm. Unhurried. Whole again. Down below, Atlanta moved endlessly through streaks of gold and shadow while rainwater still reflected across the streets from storms that had already passed. And somewhere inside the city, the people who once built an entire hidden structure around his silence were left living with the one thing they never prepared for, the realization that the quiet man they dismissed had understood the board better than all of them combined. If this story stayed with you, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe for more stories where the people nobody notices turn out to be the ones holding all the power. The elevator doors closed softly as Elias disappeared downward into the city lights, carrying nothing except the life he had finally taken back.